time for a side quest. Okay, so regular viewers will be aware that one of my aims, my goals for this portion of the year, is to get this vaguely organised craft room a little less vague. I've made a start on that. I'll give you an update when it looks like I've made more progress. But I started by going through my fabrics and wheedling out the bits that I can't use, making sure that everything is all stored together. I've got it into essentially one box and one cubby. And there may be a couple of other pieces floating around here and there, but essentially that's my entire stash. So that's pretty good. And I've put aside into this bag a selection of the remnants that I was going through that I thought, you know what, they're going to make some quite quick win projects. They're going to be good for bags, they're going to be good for cushion covers, patchwork projects, scrap projects, all that kind of thing. So this is my side quest bag. This is the bag that I will go to when I want some sort of palette cleansery project between more complicated things. I'm going to start working on one of those today, although thinking about my plans for it, I'm not sure it's going to be that much of a palette cleanser. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, now I am starting to use Procreate to come up with some ideas. Oh, this is a little bit on the reflective shiny side. Might have to see if I can put in a picture over the top of the iPad maybe, so you can see it without the shine. But what I'm thinking is making a tote bag, a large tote bag, project bag type thing in this. Ooh. The thing with learning things. Okay, you can put notes, you can put like different layers on Procreate, and my top layer is notes that we don't really need cluttering up the screen at the moment. There we go. If I hold it there, it's out of the reflection. Okay, so that's my sort of idea. So I'm thinking about using quilt squares, quilt blocks for the four main sides. So it'd be quite a square tote. I may or may not do a drawstring cover at the top. I might do some sort of other way of covering the work that's inside to keep the dust off it. But that's a problem for another day. And I'm also thinking that on the inside, if I try and get find where I put my overhead. The thing with learning new software, it does do things that you don't expect it to do sometimes. Okay, so I'm thinking of overhead having 3 square pockets on either side to put the yarn cakes in, and then a centre in the middle for your project. And then maybe some pockets for notions somewhere around. So I have a few little sort of ideas there. So I sketched that out on Procreate. Obviously my artistic skills are not the best. And I've put notes on top of it. So I'm going to pull my notes up so that I can see what I'm doing. And on that I've put things like what I'm going to need to cut out, what sort of measurements I'm going to need, that kind of thing. So we're going to start with the quilt blocks. I'm going to use log cabin quilt blocks because I've done them before, because they're good for using up scraps, and I'm hoping the neighbour's DIY is not getting picked up too much by the microphone, because that's going to be fun. So I'm going to go through my bag of remnants, my side quest bag, and find some fabrics that are going to work well together for the main parts of the block, as well as for the border of the block, which I'll also use for the base of the bag and possibly the handles, we'll see. I'm going to start by cutting out some strips. For the size of bag that I'm going for, I measured some cakes that I've got for a knitting project that I'm working on at the moment, some cakes that were waiting to be added in. So I've used that as the basis of my side because I want to have 3 pockets on either side for yarn. The reason I'm going for 6 pockets to put yarn cakes in is because to knit a sweater my size, I'm looking at 5 skeins of yarn at least, and in some patterns 6. And if I'm doing colour work, I'm also going to have multiple colours going on in the yoke. So I figured 6 pockets for yarn cakes would be a good way to have everything ready for a 1 colour sweater, and just put all your cakes in the pockets and just move around the pockets as you need to add in more yarn. And for colour work, I can have a 2 or 3 colour yoke all lined up on one side. So I think that would be quite a good way to sort of organise your projects. And because there'll hopefully be this space that's like yarn cake width in the middle, if I am doing a colour work, I can have yarn weighting in the middle as well. Obviously the bag will be taller than a cake of yarn, so they'll be set at the bottom, and you can always put the project on top if you need to. So that's the plan. So for the size that I'm going for, to wake my iPad up again, I need to cut out strips of fabric that are 2 inches wide. That will then give me 1.5 inch wide strips for my in my finished log cabin block. So I'm going to get on with that, get some strips cut out, and I'll come back and we'll start putting a log cabin block together. I'm also thinking that I do 2 standard log cabin blocks and 2 variations. So I'll see how we get on. I may or may not end up with all 4 sides matching. They may be in slightly different combinations of fabrics, but that's fine. That's very much the vibe we're going for with this bag. My initial thought for the borders and the base of the bag, if I have enough of it, is this remnant. This is left over from my dungarees. It's a twill, so it's a fairly sort of thick fabric. It does have a bit of stretch to it, but because I'm doing quilt blocks, so they're going to be quilted, and things are going to be lined and everything, I don't think that's going to cause me any issues. I'll just have to make sure that I've interfaced the base, or possibly even quilted the base as well, just to make sure that all the sides are equal to the base and we don't have socky bottoms, droopy bottoms on the bottom of our tote bag. So yeah, that's my initial thought, but we'll see what else we've got in the bag, see what will work together. Okay, so I've made my initial selection of fabrics. Now this constellation one I haven't used very much of at all. I've just used it for some pocket linings. It was a backup fabric for a dress that I made. So that I've got plenty of. So this may be lining. I may draw from it if I don't have enough of the others. But this is essentially a backup at the moment because I could use this for something else as well. But I'll definitely have enough of this for lining if I need it. So I put that to one side. And then my main fabric, so I've got the twill for the borders and the base of the bag, possibly the handles, probably the handles actually because it's a much heavier weight than the others. And then I've got these 3 cottons. So the blue and the feathers I used to make a vintage dress. When I was doing when I was working on how to improve my fit. So that I don't have huge amounts of, but I should be able to get a few 2-inch strips out of, hopefully. And if I can't, I'll go to the constellations. And then to go with that, I've got the blue gingham, and then there's that base fabric. So I'm going to, some of this fabric is a bit creased and everything, so I'm going to press some of that flat and then cut out some 2-inch strips, and we'll go from there. Okay, for the sake of visibility on the camera, I've put some washi tape on my cutting board to show the width of what I'm going to be cutting. So I'm going to be lining the fabric up with the white line just below this bit of washi tape and cutting along the bit that's just above this bit of washi tape. And obviously I'm going to be cutting in one direction. Normally you should be cutting sort of away from yourself, but this room I can't really make that work in. So I'm going to be cutting across that way. Because I cut with my right hand. I do have a rotary cutter for this. Obviously you want to be very careful with those. They aren't very, very sharp. And I'm going to have to cut in sections as well because my mat isn't as wide as the fabric. So I'm going to line up slightly scrappy edge of this one here, so I'm going to let that go just slightly over, just because that will help neaten it up. I'm just going to cut off the end here as well so that things are nice and straight and I can see where my line is to cut. I'm going to use my quilting ruler to help me to cut a straight line. Using the lines on the mat to make sure that I'm holding this straight, and I'll cut across as far as I can with the ruler, move the ruler, line that up with the cut edge, and then go again. So we want the ruler just below the line we want to cut, with everything lining up so that it's nice and straight. I'm going to hold that firmly down, take my rotary cutter and push that down into the fabric, so that should now have cut. So we'll leave that in place, put the rotary cutter away from my hands, slide the ruler down, line it up with the cut, and cut to the edge of the mat. I obviously don't want to cut into my ironing board, which is what I've got this set up on. Then we need to move the fabric. Should cut the last little bit, just because I don't have a bigger cutting mat. So make sure everything is lining up as it should be. Reposition the ruler. Just missed a little bit where I've had to reposition things, so I'll just cut through that. There we go. So there's my first 2 strips. I've got 2 at a time. I am going to just cut off the selvage edge at this end, so that doesn't get in the way of my seams. And I'm going to cut a few more strips. And I'll come back to you once I've got a nice little pile. Okay, so I'm on to my last strip cutter now. With the gingham, I've actually folded it up a few more times to cut through the length a bit more swiftly. Also, you need to be careful about this because you're trying to go through more layers, so there's more that can shift, but with this fabric it's like holding on to itself fairly nicely. Okay, so I've cut out a few strips from each fabric, and hopefully that'll be enough. If it's not, I'll just cut out a few more. So I've got my feathers, I've got my gingham, and I've got my navy. Let's talk safety and rotary cutters. Obviously the blade on a rotary cutter is very, very sharp. You want to keep your fingers away from it. That's why you cut away from yourself, not towards yourself. That's why you keep your fingers away from the edge of a quilting ruler. Now, my rotary cutter is not an expensive one. It came in a bundle of stuff with the cutting mat from that online retailer that sells everything under the sun, but it does have some nice features. So this little white circle here is a lock. So when the lock is engaged and I squeeze the trigger, the blade doesn't come down. So when I put it away, it's always locked. When I disengage the lock and I squeeze the trigger, the blade comes down. When I release the trigger, the blade goes back up again. So that feature is there to try and make sure that when you put your cutter down, having finished a line of cutting, you're not going to accidentally catch the blade. But when I'm not using it, I engage the lock. So we're going to be using it on and off as we put together these blocks, but for the most part, when I'm not using it, it's going to be locked. Okay, so to make your quilt blocks, your log cabin quilt blocks, you're going to still need your rotary cutter, your ruler and your cutting mat. You need your fabric strips. You're going to be pressing seams open, so I'll be using my iron for that. Some people finger press them. I'm just using my iron for security. Some people have little mini irons. I don't, I just have my normal iron. But I do prefer using the iron than finger pressing. It's probably fine to finger press. I mean, I know it's fine to finger press. I just don't think I've got the technique. So I'm also going to be using on my sewing machine, which I've switched out the thread for navy because I'm working in blues, I'm going to be using my 1/4 inch piecing foot, which looks like this. It's got this little thing on the side, so you can run that down the side of the fabric to measure your 1/4 inch seam. It's a little bit easier than trying to do it with the lines on your machine if you have one. If you don't have one, it's fine, but you're going to be working at 1/4 inch seams for quilt blocks, for quilts in general. The log cabin quilt block itself is a nice simple construction. It's going to start from a centre square and essentially spiral out in stripes. There's all sorts of traditions for how it would have been done originally. It's an American quilt block as far as I'm aware, and there are all sorts of symbolism that you can employ if you wish to with colours and shading and what have you. I'm just going very, very simple. So we're going to start with 2 strips of fabric. You can cut these into squares first if you wish to. I am just going to start with the strips, because then I can use the width of the strips themselves to help me cut them down to the right size. So I'm going to sew the first 2 together at right angles, and that'll give me 2 squares in the middle once I've trimmed them down with my rotary cutter. So I'll get that done, and then we'll come and add in the next strip as we go around the block itself. Okay, now that I've got my 2 strips sewn together, I'm going to take them to my cutting mat. I'm going to cut the gingham strip right next to the navy strip, and the navy strip right next to the gingham strip, and then press that seam open. That's going to give me the centre of my block. So now that we've got our 2 squares, we take our next strip of fabric and we sew it along the side. Again, a 1/4 inch seam, trim it down to match the length of the existing block and press the seam open. So there's our first 3 strips put together. I'm going to be using the plain navy as my centre square. So I'm going to put my next strip on this side, which will be in the gingham, and do the same. Everything is sewn on in exactly the same way, so I'll get a few more on there and I'll show you how we're looking. So that's the first quilt block done. I'm going to hold it away from the reel. The order that you apply the strips is going to make a different look to it, so I haven't worried too much about the middle. So I've got a blocky middle and then more sort of corners happening as we move out. So this is ready for its border, but I'll get to that in a bit. I'll border all 4 at the same time, because then I can adjust the width of the border depending on the finished size of the blocks. This is coming out at what will be 10.5 inches once it's sewn to its border at a 1/4 inch seam. So the strips are 1.5 inches once they're sewn together, because 1/4 inch seam, 2 inch strips, 2 1/4 inches is a half, so you end up with 1.5 inches. So I need to work up another one of these, and I'm going to work up 2 in a variation of the log cabin pattern, and then we'll put the borders on. Okay, so for our variation on a log cabin quilt block option, we're going to start in very much the same way, in fact exactly the same way. So we're going to again put our strips together at right angles, seam it, trim them, press it open, and apply the first 2 strips in the same way. So I'll get to that point and then I'll come back to you and show you what we do next. Okay, so here is the start of our variation log cabin block. This time we're using the feathers as the centre point of the block, and we're going to be adding all of our extra strips on the one side. So my next strip is going to go down this way, and then we'll go across this way, and then this way and this way. So this is going to end up in one corner of the block. Show you what I mean when I've got a few more strips on. Okay, so this is the variations block so far. I'm going to keep going until it's the same size as the standard block. See if I've done each corner in the same fabric, so it's creating this sort of pointy, arrowy version of the block. So we're going to end up with 2 of these and 2 of the other, ready to put our bag together. So I'm going to keep going with this. I'll show you what it's like when it's finished. And yeah, then we'll be ready for borders and quilting. Okay, so there we have our variations block complete. I quite like that. I'm rather pleased with that. So I'm going to get a second one of these done with a different centre, and then we'll be back to put some borders on. Okay, I'm partway through. In fact, not far off the end really, maybe halfway through this second variation block, and I realised I've made a bit of a boo-boo. Can you spot it? This square, this plain blue square, should be here. So the mistake was this strip here. I've put it on the wrong side. It should have gone down that side. Now, if I was doing a large quilt, I could leave it like this and do another one to match. But I ain't doing 4 blocks. So I guess the seam ripper is going to be coming out. Oh well. These things happen. As long as I'm careful unpicking the seams, I should be able to just reapply those strips in the same place. They are obviously the right length because they've been trimmed down. So as long as I'm careful, I should be fine. It's just annoying. Okay, so we are back to where we should be. Let's get the rest of this one done. Okay, so there's my final block. So we have 2 of the variation blocks, and we have 2 of the standard log cabin quilt blocks. So the next step is to cut out strips for the borders, put those on. If I was going to be doing like a larger quilt, I would be joining these together until I've got it as big as I want it to be, and then I'd be putting the borders on. But I'm not doing that. So each one is going to get a border. If it was a quilt, I would put borders down 2 sides and then across the whole top and bottom, so that you've got a full seam across the width at the top and bottom. But because I'm not doing a full quilt and these are smaller and I haven't decided which side is up yet, I'm going to cut out the strips of the borders and sew them on as if I was doing a round of the standard log cabin block. I think that'd be cohesive, and I can play around with which way I want each block to be up when I put the bag together. So I'll come back to you once I've got the borders on, and then we'll talk about quilting. Okay, so day 2. Does anybody else do that? Think, oh, that'll be a quick win project. I'll rattle through that really quickly. And then it takes several days. I mean, compared to knitting a sweater, it's a quick win. But yeah, so today we're going to quilt the blocks for the sides of the bag. I didn't have enough yardage of the fabric I used for the border to do like a square for the base. So I need to think about what I'm going to do there. I might be able to patch together another block in that fabric to get to the right size, or I might use something different and border it, we'll see. But yeah, quilting. So I have in my stash this fusible fleece. It's a Pellon fusible fleece. There's the packet. Star 987F. I bought this for a project, a bag project, a while ago, and then discovered that it was the wrong sort of thing. It wasn't what I needed. So I have this, I haven't used any of it. So we're going to use that to quilt the blocks, and when I work out what I'm doing for the base, we'll quilt that with it as well. So that then gets this polyester fleece used up. If I was going to buy something like this specifically for this sort of project, I would probably try and steer away from polyester, because that's a general move I'm making where possible. It's not always possible to not buy man-made fibres for things, but yeah, generally speaking, and for like everyday wear stuff, I'm trying to lean more into natural fibres. So stuff that's polyester and yarn that's acrylic and that sort of thing, I'm trying to get that used up gradually, and I'm trying my best not to bring more in unless I have to. So I do have one project that is essentially polyester, waiting to be sewn up. That's new stuff into the house, but it's polyester for reasons. So yeah, so we're gonna get that fused onto the quilt blocks. I'm going to also need to put a backing on, and this is only fusible on one side. So I'm going to fuse the patchworked blocks onto it so that they don't shift around. Any backing fabric that I put on, I'm not so concerned about if that shifts or not, because that's also going to then have lining on top of it. What I don't want is the log cabin blocks to shift. So we'll get that done, and I'll show you how I'm quilting them on my sewing machine because they're quite small. Okay, so I've fused the blocks onto the fleece. You might notice they're not perfectly square, but that's fine, because once it's all quilted, we'll trim them down to the size we need. And I've also sorted out a backing fabric for this so that the fleece doesn't get caught in my feed dogs and do weird things. So this is, yeah, noisy. This is why this remnant has been sitting around in my stash for a while. I made a blouse out of this years ago, and it looks lovely. It looks very crisp. It's a shirting. So yeah, great look. The feel is fine in terms of the hand of it, but it's a very crisp fabric, and it's quite noisy when you're moving around wearing it. So ASMR for you. So yeah, so I never reached for that blouse, never wore it. So now this remnant pops up every once in a while as the backing for an embroidery project, and now it's backing quilt blocks. So what I'm going to do is pair up the blocks and the backing fabric, and then take them to the machine and put some quilt stitching in. I'm still going to be using the blue because the bulk of the block is blue. And when I come to stitch the bag up, I may well change colour, we'll see. I still have thread left from making the dungarees, so I may use the same colour as that because that worked really well with the dungarees fabric. Just kind of depends on how much ends up being on show. And the lining is probably going to be that, well, it's definitely going to be that Constellation fabric because that's fabulous. And colour-wise, it matches the exterior. And I've got plenty of it, so yeah. Right, so let's get on with pairing these up. Okay, so I've clipped, using Wonder Clips, the backing onto the front. If it was a bigger project, I would be looking at quilt pins throughout the main bit, or hand tacking it. And you could do either of those things with these as well. I'm just using wonder clips because that's what I have on hand and I can't be bothered to hand tack. You want to keep your backing as smooth as you can as you're putting it on. Do you know what? I think I am going to need to hand tack because I've got the backing slightly larger than the squares. It's just not going to sit smooth. So yeah, so I'm going to pick out a contrast thread and actually bother to hand tack. Look at me, shine my halo, being a good girl. Okay, so we'll do that. We'll hand tack it down, and then the wonder clips can come off, and then I can take it to the machine, and we'll decide how we're going to sew these quilt lines. Okay, so I've got my quilt sandwiches done. So we've got 3 layers. We've got the patchwork, we've got the wadding, the fleece I've put in, and we've got the backing. And I've tacked it together all the way through. Now I'm going to be keeping it simple with the quilting. And I'm going to be doing what's called stitch in the ditch. So I'm going to be sewing as close as possible to the line that has already been stitched. And so we'll take it easy, take it slow. There'll be lots of turning, so stopping, needle down, lift the foot, turn the fabric, fold the quilt dot over so it fits in the throw to my machine. So yeah, we're going to take it easy and keep it simple, but simple is sometimes really effective. Okay, so I've got a couple of the blocks done. So here we have unquilted, log cabin, and quilted. So I've even taken out the tacking stitches as well. So it's subtle, not a big difference, but this one is looks a bit flatter than this one. So the quilting just gives it a bit of dimension. And again with the variation block, this is it unquilted, and this is the quilted version. So it's just a little bit more depth, a little bit more dimension. And if you're careful doing the stitch and ditch technique on these sorts of blocks, you can actually do it all in one go without having to cut the thread, which means you've got fewer tails to deal with at the end. It does mean some areas get stitched over twice. So if I show you the back, you'll see what I mean. Some of the lines are a bit darker than others, where I've had to turn and go back on myself, but that's fine. Some of them are slightly better matched up to the previous stitching than others, but again, that's fine. Okay, so if you were going to be using these as placemats, or if you had a heat-proof wadding, you could use them as pot holders. Obviously a bit smaller than this for a pot holder, but you know what I mean. But all you would need to do would be to true up the square and put binding on. If you wanted to put an envelope back on it, you've got a cushion cover. So in and of themselves, they're pretty much almost a finished product. I'm going to be turning mine into a bag. So I'm going to get on and quilt the other 2 squares, work out what I'm doing for the base, as I didn't have enough yardage to cut a square out this size. To be fair, it is pretty big. So work out what I'm doing for the base and work out how I'm going to construct the lining. So next time that I come back to you with this particular project, which hopefully will be next week, might be a couple of weeks, but hopefully next week, depends how long it takes me to work out how to do the lining and to solve the base issue. But then at that point we'll be trimming these up, making sure they're all exactly the same size, as well as the base square, putting them together and putting the lining together. So we'll be turning it all into quite a sizable tote bag. I mean, this is definitely going to be big enough for sweaters, might even be big enough for blanket projects depending on the size of the blanket. So yeah, that's going to be really useful. Okay, so thank you for spending time with me today. I will see you in the next one, and in the meantime, there's this video here that may be of interest to you.